Alrighty. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This panel came together due to our deeper curiosity about the city and the community we occupy as students at the University of Chicago. We're excited to be in company with our brilliant panelists. Thank you for your help and for coming together with us. Special thanks to SSR, Shannon and Gray, you're the best for helping us with all of this. Chris Grable at Chicago Studies and our great faculty in sociology for their support and supporting us with this event and doing all that they do for us. We hope everyone enjoys the event. I'm Raina. I helped organize, co-organize the event, and Noah is on as well. She did a great job co-organizing, and we love getting everyone together to have this conversation. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll leave it to the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Raina, and thank you for folks who are attending, and thank you to this wonderful panel. My name is Ruben Miller. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago, and my work has largely been on the lives and experiences of formerly incarcerated people and incarcerated people in Chicago and Detroit, but also I've done some international work and some work in New York and some other cities across the country. But we're here today to talk about politics in the intro to Chicago politics, and this is about local politics, very local politics in Hyde Park, Chicago, and in our local kind of South Side area. And I'm pleased to be joined by Alex Goldenberg, who's the executive director of Southside Together Organizing for Power, the brilliant Alice Kim, who I'm always happy to be on a panel with, director of human rights practice, and a brilliant brother, Chris Williams, in the Department of Sociology here. And so we figure each one will say a little bit about who they are and what they do and their interests, and then we'll dive right into some questions about what's happening in the place in which we now work and live. So let's start with Alex, and then we'll go down. Alex, Alice, and Chris.
Cool. Thanks for having me. Again, I'm Alex Goldenberg, director of Southside Together Organizing for Power. We are a community organization based right in Woodlawn and surrounding neighborhoods. We've been around since 2004. I actually got involved as an undergrad at the University of Chicago back in 2004. It started when there was an effort by the university to purchase and demolish a 500-unit public housing complex just south of the university called Grove Park. And I got involved as a volunteer and started building some relationships with folks and just got sucked in deeper and deeper. And have been with the organization ever since. So we primarily, we are a direct action community organizing group. We have three main areas of work: housing, mental health, and youth. And yeah, looking forward to the conversation today.
Hi, folks. I'm Alice Kim. I direct the Human Rights Lab, which is a 5-year initiative of the Posen Family Center for Human Rights here at the University of Chicago. The lab is focused on engaging students, faculty, and community in human rights work that addresses incarceration and targeted criminalization. I also teach with the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education Project at Stateville Prison, which I will say a little bit more about later on in our conversation. But I've been teaching at Stateville for the last about 5 years now, and think about the people who are incarcerated and locked up there really every day. Especially under these conditions of the pandemic. I have also long worked with people who are Chicago police torture survivors, tortured by former Commander John Burge, and people who are facing death by incarceration, initially via the death penalty and now via life sentences. So I'll just say that and hand it over to Chris.
Perfect, perfect. I'm not as cool as our other guests. I don't do as cooler things, but I'm Chris. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Sociology. I'm a lifelong Chicagoan, a lifelong Southsider. And my research mostly is oriented towards race in the law. Specifically, I look at policing in the law and how the policing of Black and Brown communities on the South Side, and how, specifically I look at, how how the city responds to different waves of homicides in Chicago. And so we can talk more about the politics of that as we get into our panel.
Okay, this is fantastic. So the opening question was supposed to be about the pressing sociopolitical issues that the Southside and Hyde Park communities face, but I have a very specific question. Really, I want to begin for Alex. And when you talked about very briefly your work in Grove Park, and then I think this is something that maybe we can all jump on too. So Grove Park is gone, you know, right? Like the buildings were bought, community, you know, it's been, you know, there's a squash court over there now, you know, life looks very different. And so you kind of cut your teeth, you said, organizing with these groups. And as communities change and new issues begin to the needs of the community change, I wonder what role do organizers play when in fact the issues that say they were helping to organize against happen, you know, or when communities change or displaced. There's a I should shut up now, but there's a really practical example. I'm thinking about not a set of organizers, but a community-based organization, specifically Cabrini Green Legal Aid. Well, Cabrini Green is gone, and CGLA is changed in many ways and sort of expanded its footprint and is doing different kinds of policy advocacy. But I wanted to hear from you, Alex, specifically about, you know, what you do when the community changes in such a drastic way, and then perhaps other folks can talk about what you do when the socio-political context starts to shift from under us. So let's start there.
Yeah, and so I mean, the Grove Park story is really interesting. It's gone, but it's also not gone. So it, you know, while the buildings have changed, there was actually a really important victory that took place there, where a tenants association organized and fought back against a foreclosure that at the time Bishop Brazier, who's the father of the current Brazier, who runs the Apostolic Church of God, they were owning and managing the building. They were allowing it to go into disrepair. Their plan was to let it go into foreclosure, give every tenant a voucher, and get them all out of the neighborhood. We worked with the tenants to form a tenants association, which actually developed its own vision for redevelopment, recruited a developer based out of Boston called Preservation of Affordable Housing. And after a lot of effort, which culminated in a sit-in where we ended up barricading ourselves inside the offices of HUD, forced them to agree to the tenants' redevelopment vision. And we won one-for-one replacement of all 504 units that used to be there. It's been a long process, so they haven't fully been rebuilt, but there's about 400 units that have so far been brought back to the community, not all in the original footprint, but all within the neighborhood. So it's a really important victory, and also I think speaks to what this event was trying to get a little bit in terms of the local politics, you know, where you have some of these local power players who, you know, were playing a role that I think, you know, is one that's been kind of unfolding since the 60s, you know, since there was a move, you know, by big philanthropy and the powers that be to really get, you know, folks that were involved in organizing and direct action more so into housing development management, social services, right? And that's kind of where the figurehead leaders of Woodlawn, which were Brazier and Leon Finney, you know, when I kind of walked into this space, you know, that's the role that they were playing. And they were profiting from these developments and were no longer accountable in the way that they once were. But the fact that those tenants came together, pushed back, and won that redevelopment, I think is really significant. But of course, that's in the context of a hyper gentrifying neighborhood, which, of course does speak to, I think, what you're getting at. And just a few blocks away is an example of a fight that we didn't win so well, which was the mental health clinic fight. So we also fought to save the Woodlawn Mental Health Clinic, which closed back in 2011. We were working, with some of the residents in a housing development near that clinic, who were telling us if they close our clinic, there's no point in saving our home because it's just another way of pushing us out. And so we decided to take on that fight. And, we tried a barricade there too, but it didn't work that time. Rahm Emanuel managed to wait us out and buy off a lot of local church leaders, social service providers. And they ended up, closing half of the city's public health clinics. And, that we're still working to get those clinics reopened, but, it's been a fight that has gotten harder and harder as some of the leaders in that fight have died because the consequences of no longer having access to those services. They are spreading out and separating. And so, there's a huge amount of fragmentation. And I think that's the, when you're trying to organize a political constituency to fight for something, when they're just being fractured and split in half and more mobile and moving back and forth from the suburbs and so on. I think that becomes part of the context that you have to work through, which I think gets at some of the question that you're asking.
So perhaps we can ask that question and like the question that should have been the opening question, which are what do we think the sociopolitical issues are in the South Side and that the Hyde Park community, the way the communities in Hyde Park, surrounding Hyde Park are facing now? Like what are the issues that we should be thinking about now?
I think I'll jump in. I think one of and obviously this is me, this is me kind of cherry picking and being really specific to my own research agenda. But obviously right now, policing is something that's really big in the news. And we're talking about these national conversations about defunding the police. So in Hyde Park, we have the second largest private police force in the world outside of the Vatican. And the UChicago Police Department they get permission to exist from the university. And I want to point out that, the policing in Hyde Park and the surrounding communities looks different, right? Because Hyde Park is a particularized place that has, it's a place that looks a lot different from the rest of its surrounding communities. When you think of Inglewood, or you think of Woodlawn, or you think of Northern Kenwood. And so the tension between policing and how people are policed is vastly important. When you're talking about the income levels and how people with, who are raised differently, of differing income levels, policing in those communities looks different, right? Policing in, a few blocks away from, let's just say on Woodlawn, policing on 59th and Woodlawn looks a lot different from policing on 61st and Woodlawn. And you have, different justifications, such as, in one area, the policing may look like we're policing to protect people, and policing in the other area, maybe we're policing to weed out criminals, right? And so I think a pressing issue for us at the university and the South Side of Chicago generally is rethinking how we respond to crime, what we consider as crime, and the people who come under the threat of policing. If we look at the way in which the city has responded to different crime waves or different homicide waves, we see that overwhelmingly the response to crime in the city of Chicago, at least as it relates to policing, has been in fact to increase funding to policing, despite cyclical waves of what we would call crime and violence. And what that has led to is increased surveillance of communities of color like Kenwood, like Woodlawn, not necessarily Hyde Park. We see increased surveillance, we see massive amounts of people going to jail, but we don't see is a reduction in so-called crime, right? And so I think we are deeply implicated as the University of Chicago community and the Southside community, because these are people who we wake up, these are our neighbors, this is who we are as a Southside person. And so I think, you know, a conversation about politics can't, in the South Side in Chicago, cannot be done properly without acknowledging policing being one of the largest problems that we have in the city.
I want to stay with this policing theme for a hot second. I think it draws us all together. Let me tell you the way I think it draws us together. First of all, Alice, you know, historically your work, certainly around Burge and also, you know, folks who are doing long sentences, like constant interactions with the police. And then Chris's point about the centrality of the police in a place like, and you know, of our police department. But then Alex just mentioning a hot second ago, like the role of the police in breaking up sort of organizing, right? Like the police, you know, Rahm sends the police come, the police, you know, arrest folks. And it makes me think about like how we think about crime to this point that Chris just raised. So I'd like for Alice, if you could, to help us think about the role of the police, how we think about crime, how we think about crimes that police commit, and maybe walk us through some of your work, and then to just and then please take your time with that, because so much of that story is beautiful. And then when we shoot back to Alex, I'd like for you to help us think about, you know, organizing as crime. So on the one hand, police crime, and then organizing and organizers, you know, being seen as folks who are breaking the law and committing crime. So let's do that.
Okay, so yeah, police are really the first point of contact, right, for people who end up in the system, who end up in our jails, and who end up in our prisons. And it's been said that mass incarceration is the civil rights issue of our time. And I think it certainly is one that people who live on the South Side of Chicago and in the Hyde Park neighborhood and neighboring communities, it's certainly one that people face. So one thing that I wanted to do, I think that Raina had described this as a panel that would introduce students to some of the politics and political work that is happening in the city of Chicago. And I actually wanted to take us on a really brief little mini tour of 3 carceral sites in Chicago, in the Chicago area. So first, just 11 miles north and a little bit west of Hyde Park, you have Cook County Jail, also known by many as Crook County Jail. Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve is the title of her book, Crook County Jail. And it's a vast jail that is the size of 72 football fields, or 96 acres. And it's in a part of town called Little Village that tourists to Chicago rarely visit, but again, is a well-known site to many on the South Side of Chicago and to Black and Brown people in the Chicago area. So in 2019, 60,000 people cycled through Cook County Jail. People may be familiar with it because it was named a national hotspot early on when the pandemic first came to be. And in response to public pressure, you did see the number of people who were detained, who were locked up at Cook County Jail decrease. Typically, you have around 5,000. Today, it decreased to around 4,000, but today we're seeing increasing numbers locked up at Cook County Jail once again. And again, it's predominantly Black and brown people. And then just nearby Cook County Jail, you have the Illinois Youth Center, but don't let the name fool you. It is in fact a prison for kids. It's a jail for kids. And due to the work of organizations like the Children and Family Justice Center, the governor announced over the summer that Illinois would be closing its 5 remaining youth prisons, youth jails. So that is certainly something that is welcome. Currently, we still across the state have about 100 kids locked up in our jails, and I think about 85% of them are actually Black and brown. So something to keep in mind. In Illinois, you can actually lock young people up, young teens up. The typical age of people who are locked up is around 16 years old. And essentially people are locked up because they don't have the money to bond out. They don't, and thanks to the work of groups like Chicago Community Bond Fund, you're actually seeing that pretrial detention is becoming a thing that we are hoping to end, whether it's for adults or for young people. Another thing that we should all know about the young people who are locked up is that many of the young people, and this is very much related to the question and the problem of our mental health clinics being closed, is that by the majority of young people who are locked up are taking some sort of some type of meds to address psychological conditions, or have been have some type of psychological conditions that they need to have addressed. So that's Cook County Jail, the Illinois Youth Center, and then just 30 miles outside of Chicago, we actually have Stateville Prison, Stateville Correctional Center. It's a prison, it's a maximum security prison for men. There's approximately 5,000 people who are locked up at Stateville Prison. It's the place where I've been teaching classes and where I facilitate a think tank on long-term sentencing. And it is a place, I have a quote from one of the students who described what it is like at Stateville. Let's see. He calls it, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but a dark and oppressive place that really strips you of your humanity. And this is what's happening right around us. So just situating ourselves, in Hyde Park to 3 carceral sites. And I think over the years, much of my work, either as an organizer, as an activist, or as an educator inside prisons, takes place on the South Side of Chicago. So it certainly is an issue that we face. And I think that here on our campus, it can also, it can be easy to think that we're immune to some of these issues, that people who are system impacted aren't on our campus, aren't among our student body, aren't among our faculty or staff, but it is an issue that is actually very close to us. And I think, as Chris said, that we have to be thinking about what are the ways in which we may be complicit with this, and what are the ways in which we can actually challenge it. So I'll just leave it there.
Did you still want me to weigh in on the?
I would love that. Yeah.
Okay, or organizing as crime. Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely been a long tradition, right, in this country to criminalize organizers and activists. And Chicago has definitely been at the forefront of that, right? or the city, which famously, kicked down the doors of sleeping Black Panthers on the West Side and murdered them in cold blood, right? Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And so, we've experienced that, ourselves in our organizing, in terms of criminalizing our work, both by Chicago police and, interestingly, university police. The work around the mental health clinics was infiltrated by undercover police, which were identified. Some of them actually took arrest with some of the activists and went to jail with them in their effort to try to convince people. This was around the time of the NATO protests, and they were trying to trick people into putting together Molotov cocktails, and a few people ended up getting arrested for that. The NATO's 7 or 5, I think. Similarly, actually, there was a long fight to get the University of Chicago to open a trauma center. And at one of our actions, there was somebody who was holding a sign, and activists, they tend to recognize how police walk and move. They have that gut feeling. And so somebody kind of walked over and put their phone over her shoulder and actually snapped a picture of her phone where she was texting the University of Chicago police commander and talking about they're moving north on Woodlawn now, or something like that. And it was right there in plain sight. And so this effort to I think infiltrate and criminalize, as opposed to actually engaging with the issue that is being raised, right, is kind of a pattern that we've actually definitely experienced and seen. One other kind of interesting anecdote about the trauma center is, one of the actions that did lead to some arrests. It was a sit-in where there was the charge was trespassing. This was the admin building of the president of the university, that some folks locked themselves inside, and this was after 5 years of the struggle, and things were kind of really coming to a head. The defense that we argued with the help of the National Lawyers Guild attorneys is called the necessity defense, which is that action had to be taken because if it wasn't taken, a greater harm would have been caused. That harm being more people would be dying on the South Side due to lack of trauma care. And while that case was going on, the university finally conceded and gave in to open and agreed to open the trauma center. And that necessity defense actually persuaded the judge, and they actually got off. And so, despite the university's efforts to, push, the maximum charge as possible. So yeah, I think that's kind of the general pattern that I've experienced, is that, instead of really deeply engaging with the issues, there's immediately an effort to criminalize the activity.
So I think this is all fascinating. I mean, Chris, you mentioned changing ideas about crime and criminality, and what a part of the politics is certainly the politics of policing, what gets policed under what circumstances, what counts for a crime, when, where, and how, who commits it, what kinds of charges do you see, these kinds of things. And we certainly don't see the same kinds of accountability. I mean, there's reasons for that, of course, we could talk about probably for the remaining time that we have, that we don't see the same kinds of accountability practices, or practice to hold police accountable for the crimes they commit, be that sexual assault or murder, or any of the, in Chicago has been a hotbed and fulcrum of organizing activity to change both the narrative and the practices of sort of policing. But it moves, in your comment, Chris, about the size of our police force and what that means in relation to the rest of the world, raises a question about the relationship between the university and the communities that you've talked about as being over policed. So I just wanted us to sort of think together about the relationship between the university and the communities that the university is situated in.
Yeah, and I'll jump in here and I'll say, I think you know, I love this, the idea of this panel is an excellent idea. And it's because all of the things we've talked about thus far are actually political decisions, right? They're the result of policies made by political actors. So when I'm talking about policing, know that policing is something that the way we orient police, the way we fund police, that's something that was policy implemented by the mayor, followed through by the alderman and the city council, right? So these are all things that I want to stress, that these things aren't inevitable, right? These are political decisions that folks can change, right? And that we collectively can change through, you know, organizing, through, to the extent that we can change things through the political process, voting and things of that nature. Those are all things that are a part of the piece of the puzzle. But a part of getting to that point is recognizing the geography of the place in which we sit in, right? So I encourage everybody on the call, if you do it right now or if you do it later, to just Google Chicago segregation map. And if you Google that, you will see the South Side is primarily Black. The Southeast side of the city has is Black and Latinx. If you look at the Southwest side, you're going to see Black folks still. You're going to see Latinx folks. The West side, you're going to see Black folks. The Northwest side, you're going to see Black and Latinx folks. And primarily on the North side is where you're going to see a clustering of white folks. And if you look at one of the only integrated areas in the city, it's going to be Hyde Park, right? It's going to be Hyde Park, but that's just because the University of Chicago and the folks that carve out. It doesn't make sense geographically when you look at the map because of how segregated Chicago is. And again, segregation is a political matter, right? It's a result of political decisions about housing and where to put people at. And so when we're thinking about the University of Chicago's relationship to the city and to its surrounding communities, you have to realize that it is surrounded, it is essentially a gentrification spot that is surrounded by Black communities, primarily impoverished Black communities, right? And the UChicago doesn't just exist in a vacuum. It is a very intentional decision that it exists in the place that it does. And the second part, aside from acknowledging the history of politics and the geography of the city, is acknowledging the voices of the people in the city, right? So what do the people around us call the neighborhood, right? What do they call the areas around them? Because they don't call it Woodlawn. They don't call it Inglewood. What are the terms that they refer to it as? They may say, I live in 600. They may say, I live in the O. They may say, I live in Taquanway. They may say, I live in TYMB. What do all of those things mean? And how does that characterize these folks' lived everyday experiences, right? And so I think in reckoning with our history with the surrounding community, we have to first know the community. We have to first know the geographical terrain, and we have to know the politics of it and what our role is. But until we know the voices of the people, what do they call it? What's their experience? What's their experience with the university? When they come on the university, are they treated as I would be treated, or are they treated as an outsider, right? Or when they're policed, are they policed differently, right? What is it in the context of the larger city? So I would start our conversation there.
Just and whoever, Alice or Alex, you know, just thinking about the university's relationship with the communities that surround it. I'm curious about your thoughts there.
First, I just want to really agree with Chris and echo what he's saying about knowing people's lived experiences and actually valuing that kind of knowledge. And you know, I can say that in the Chicago police torture cases for the survivors who were tortured by John Burge systematically between 1972 to 1991, this question of not knowing who survivors were, not knowing their specific stories, survivors not feeling heard, listened to, survivors feeling disbelieved and disregarded, was really a critical part of this story. and that it was survivors who insisted on having their stories be told in spite of, the cover up from the city, in spite of even sometimes their own lawyers not believing them, was also critical to getting to the place where we're at now, nearly or more than 4 decades later, with reparations being passed by the city of Chicago in 2015 to actually address the harm that was done to people who were tortured, to their family members, and to their communities. So I think that that is a critical aspect of this. In terms of the tensions and the relationship between the community and the university, I think the way that I see it is that there will be deep tensions as long as you have a wealthy institution that sits right within a community that is under-resourced, underprivileged, underinvested. Those deep tensions are going to exist. And I feel really grateful for the work of the UChicago Reparations Working Group, because I think that they really point to, what needs to be done to begin to repair relations and to begin to repair harm. And recently, actually, over the summer, the UChicago Reparations Working Group wrote a piece along with other community members that actually discusses what steps, or just helps us think what steps the university could take, but also helps us, I think, all think about this question of this relationship and what might need to be done. And they really laid out in this article, if I'm remembering correctly, a few different things that they're kind of pushing the university to look at. And one is the representation of BIPOC people on the faculty and also within the student body, and that in and of itself is an important rubric to think about these kinds of relationships. The other thing that they push for is really asking, what kind of involvement and what kind of say does the community have in, community engaged initiatives that are sponsored by the university. And I think that for all of us to really be thinking about that question is a critical question. And then I think what the Reparations Working Group has really been insisting and demanding is that the university itself actually acknowledge its own role and its own history and its own complicity, in slavery and the benefits that it's gained from that. And, in this moment where this discussion about monuments around the whole country has been taking place, and where the new National Lynching Memorial and Museum have really served as a beacon in many ways for us to think about how we can confront racialized violence and create spaces for those kinds of conversations. And here in Chicago, as we're continuing to grapple with, as part of the reparations ordinance, the city had agreed to construct a memorial to the survivors, and that's the last component of the reparations ordinance that has yet to be realized. The importance of actually confronting this history and acknowledging the truth and creating spaces like that. So I feel really grateful to the Reparations Working Group for offering, in many ways, what I think is a rubric to help us think about, if we, this question about the relationship between the university and the community and what needs to be done.
Yeah, I have so much to say about this question. It's been a real central part of our work for a long time. For me, I think one of the really important texts to helping me understand the role of the university is the book Making of the Second Ghetto, which has a brilliant chapter about the role of the university in urban renewal, in pushing out poor people from Hyde Park. to create the kind of enclave that we see today. You know, there's a moniker about Hyde Park that's that kind of gets at what Chris was talking about in terms of its integration. Black and white united against the poor is how people talked about Hyde Park for a number of years. And you know, and that you know, from racially restrictive covenants to urban renewal, the university, you know, there's been a kind of clear path and continuation of those policies. You know, you can paint a direct line to where we are today. When I first came onto the campus back in 2002, the university was sort of going through a shift in terms of their posture with the surrounding community. So for a long time, the policy was really just, you know, circle up, completely close off, build, you know, big walls. And around that time, they moved to attempt a more kind of community engagement kind of approach, which, you know, in the last I'd say, you know, 5 to 10 years, we've seen with Derek Douglas at the head of community engagement has kind of come to fruition. And what we're seeing now is efforts at addressing, you know, some of the longstanding concerns that the surrounding community has. But certainly, you know, I think it's all done through a really clear neoliberal policy playbook, and one that, you know, doesn't for a second sacrifice the real core kind of self-interest, you know, of the university as corporation, to, you know, to maximize its profits at the expense of the surrounding neighborhood. So definitely in terms of development, you know, the university is a hugely active player in housing and real estate development. They have a very strong real estate office, right? So if you want to talk about what's the role, you have to look there. They have a huge policy shop, you know, that's shaping education policy, that's shaping healthcare policy. You know, there was an effort to try to get Illinois hospitals, you know, many of which are, or most of which are nonprofits, to pay property taxes to contribute to the public infrastructure. And, you know, the university lobbyists were one of the main people who squashed that, right? The University of Chicago doesn't pay property taxes, right? Because they're a nonprofit. And not only are they not paying in to support, you know, public infrastructure, they're also actively trying to undo it by supporting neoliberal policies like closing of clinics, of public clinics, you know, and private, you know, charter schools for education, right? They're actively supporting these policies. So their footprint on the community is both huge and, you know, to Chris's point, something that's felt by people every day. You know, there's young people who we worked with, you know, who all have a story. You know, there was a meeting, you know, we've had, you know, since I was a student, we sometimes use the space to hold meetings. You know, there's a number of stories of meetings that we had where students were harassed by the police just walking on the campus, right? One of the students was wearing pink Chucks, and the police said, you know, somebody was reported in the gym to have stolen something wearing pink shoes, you know, and they like detained him, and it took like, you know, 15 people to come out who were obviously privileged students to talk them out of that, you know, and that's not the experience that everyday community members have, and certainly that keeps them from going onto the campus, from benefiting from this huge amount of resources that's right there, right? People don't know that anybody can use the library, right? But folks don't use the libraries, right? There's tons of free spaces for meetings. People don't use these spaces, right? Why? Because there's a history and a legacy of both walling everything off and making people feel like they're not welcome, right? Most people in Woodlawn didn't even know there used to be a subway at the, you know, when they first opened the new dorm on 61st and Ellis, you know, they put it in the basement and they didn't really put a big sign because they didn't want people coming in, you know. People from the neighborhood would of course come to a subway, but they intentionally kept that hidden, you know. And so I think that really tells, you know, what the position is. Right now we're part of a big effort around the Obama Center coming and making sure that the development that surrounds the Obama Center doesn't result in displacement and folks getting pushed out. It's a community benefits agreement campaign. We recently won an important victory around the set of housing policies that the city put in place, including setting aside some vacant lots that will only, will be set aside for affordable housing in Woodlawn. But there isn't money to, for that, for the development of that. And so when you look around, who has the money to do that? It's the University of Chicago, right? They have this huge amount of wealth and endowment, and a history of wrongs, of displacement, of pushing people out, of denying people access to care. And so, in the spirit of reparations, as Alice was talking about, investing in community development that actually stabilizes the community, that creating affordable housing, investing in the youth programs, in the public schools that are surrounding it, not just their charter schools that they're building up, right? Are concrete things that the university, needs to be doing, and things that are actively being demanded of it. So I think there are, certainly some improvements in this like turn towards community engagement that's being led by Derek Douglas and others. There's local businesses that are now, vendors in the libraries, which never existed when I first came on campus. That's a really important and big development. Like you have that. I'm not going to not acknowledge that. But I think what we're seeing is a realization that the university has to give some concessions, right, and do some things that they should be able to point to, so that they don't have to grapple with the much bigger, conversation in the reparations framework about what is the historical harm that this institution has done, what are the resources that they've extracted from the South Side, and what needs to be done to right that harm, right? And that's a much larger investment than just opening up the library cafe to a local restaurateur to work in, so I'll stop there.
This brings me to what I think will be, well, two questions. So the first, is really about you and your practices, your political practice. And really, how do you know what to get involved in? How do you know what's the thing? And I heard listen, but I don't know. I just like to go a little more specific, which is a great point. Like listen, but how do you know what's the pressing danger of the moment that's going to require your attention, your effort, what to plug into, how to plug in. And I think that's a relevant question for, in fact, it is the next question. It's a question on the list, which is question 2 students, right? How to think about like what things to get involved, how to address the problems. But I'm more curious about your own process. How do you know which pressing problem to attune to in a given moment? And so anyway, I'll shut up, and whoever wants to jump in, just please do.
That's actually a hard question, I think. And I think the answer for me is that there's so many things. I mean, there's so many things you could pay attention to. There's not a lack of oppressive things in the city of Chicago to pay attention to. So I'll start by saying there. So with that in mind, the broad blanket of oppression, I think that for me, it is where are the tool set that I have? How can I be most helpful, right? And for me, I have a law degree. So I understand how laws and policing work. So it's a natural extension for me. Okay, this is how I can be most useful. I'm not exactly sure how, there are communities that I care about. There are other things that I care about, like environmental pollution, but I'm not well versed in how urban environmental pollution and politics surrounding it, like organizing. So I support people, but I'm not like on the front lines because that's not where my skill set is, right? So my skill set is in policing, the law, and crime. And so how do I get involved with that, right? So for me, that is, investigative research, essentially, right? So what I'll do is I lend my support and my help to organizations who are doing the work, but I also am producing scholarship because I'm at a university that is going to be subversive, that is going to call attention to things, right? It's going to make people feel uneasy, right? At least highlighting the history and the practices of things, because that's where I fit in, right? That's where my tool set is most attuned to fighting things. But in addition, it's also a deeply personal project, right? I am a Southside Chicagoan, right? I am this community, right? Like this community made me, and I live here, and I care about the people who live here, right? So outside of just my tool set, I just care about people, and I care about the experiences that they have. And I can't wake up every day in Hyde Park knowing I spend my tuition dollars here and not do something about my role, right, in the surrounding communities. I think it is improper to live in the community, eat the food of the community, be around the people in the community, and not fight for the people in the community. This is where we live. This is our investment. This is where we live every day, right? So the people down the street are our neighbors who are being overly policed, who are getting pushed out, that Alex is talking about, right? These are our people who are getting locked up. We can't distance ourselves from them, right? And so I think you get in where you fit in, but you can't, the option is not to get in because you play a part. You can't distance yourself from what's going on in the city because you're here, you live here, right? And on a fundamental level, you should just care about people. So that would be my response.
Amen. No, I mean, yeah, I agree 100%. I think, I guess what I'll add is, I mentioned earlier the story about like the mental health clinic, how it kind of came to our attention, while we were working on a tenant meeting. And so I think, that idea of listening, it's like listening to what the issues that people are bringing, that they're really passionate about, right? And trying to pay attention to that, and not, not get walled off by, whatever, organizational or, what your agenda, is in a particular situation. I think we did not, anticipate taking on the fight to save the mental health clinics when we were trying to work on fixing leaky radiators and busted stoves and stuff, but I think kind of being open and to Chris's point, like building real relationships with people, right? When you do that, that's going to unlock, all kinds of potential. So I would say, starting there is, trying to build real relationships, listen, pay attention to what's going on around you. And I completely agree with Chris. There's no shortage of fights from care not cops, right on campus, the work around the CBA, mutual aid work happening right now in the pandemic. There's so much. So, yeah.
So my work has really been focused and centered on people, when it comes to the carceral system, people who have been considered the worst of the worst. I think in our current movements to decarcerate, oftentimes reform efforts that are being sought are going after a low-hanging fruit, often pits nonviolent offenders against violent offenders. And I have long felt that those have been false binaries and problematic paradigms for us to be thinking about. So when I was working with people who were condemned to death, who were facing a death penalty, it was really also about creating platforms for folks themselves to speak their truths. So at that time, and this was in the late 90s when we didn't have the kind of technology that we have today, and this idea actually came from somebody who was on death row himself, was to hold live from death row events where people who were on death row got to speak to classrooms and churches and rallies in their own voices. And they got to tell their stories. And, you know, Angela Davis said that the ideologies that support the prison system, that they demonize those who are in the prison system. And it's really about combating that ideology. And how do we do that? And I think what is really critical to combating those ideologies is to center people who are facing these sentences, people who are directly impacted, system impacted themselves. And oftentimes it's for, to find ways to create platforms so that people can tell their truths, and create these platforms and uplift those platforms. So I think it's, in deciding how do you do the work or what do you get involved in, for me, it has been about, Brian Stevenson, he calls it being proximate to injustice, right? So getting close to injustice. If there's no way that you can solve these problems, there's no way you can solve social injustices without getting proximate to that. So I think that that's been really important. One of the things in the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education Project that we've really realized, though, that it is at once being proximate to the injustice, but also really being able to uplift the humanity that you see behind the prison walls, the humanity, the brilliance that really is in our classrooms, providing, again, platforms so that people can see for themselves the art that gets created in spite of horrific and inhumane prison conditions, the writing and the stories and the essays that can get created, or just the lived reality of what is happening. So I think that that is really critical too, to ensure that the way that you're doing the work, how you do the work is just as important as the ultimate outcome that you want to achieve. And then I think also just thinking about the work as something that's not simply kind of this extracurricular thing to be doing, but as something that is a long-term investment of yourself, because these are long-term problems that we have that often can have some short-term and immediate goals, but that really, thinking about the ways in which we really need to reimagine, I think Chris said it earlier, reimagine a different way to address crime in our neighborhoods, right? A different way to do that, to really end our reliance on prisons and policing. And that's something that you have to think about for the long term, not just the short term.
This is great. Well, my last question for you, I want to take at the end once we've done Q&A, which would be ways for people to be active, ways for students to slot in. But I want to jump now right into the Q&A. So there are a few questions that we have, and we're certainly interested in hearing from you. One is how does the relationship play? How does gentrification play in the relationship between UChicago, the police, and the Hyde Park community at large? That's an open question to whomever wants to jump in.
I can kick it off. I mean, I think university is a gentrifying force in the community. And so I think being clear about that, it's an international phenomenon. It's no different right here in our own backyard where, it's playing out before our eyes. So I think understanding that the speculative real estate market is pushing people out at a fast clip. The community is changing quickly. And it's really, it's a fight for survival and for the, really for the communities to continue to be what they've been, as what is at stake in this fight. So yeah, and I think, relatedly, the developer class that is behind gentrification is increasingly the most powerful political player in the city. And so, so we're up against some very, very powerful interests. That I think, because getting at the politics was, I think, part of the objective of this panel. I just want to raise that I think they really are one of the biggest forces, them and finance, that control the mayor. And historically in Chicago, the mayor has then, had a very tight grip on the local alderman. That's being reshuffled a little bit now with Lightfoot, but it seems to be falling into place, no different than it has been for decades. So yeah.
I have a gentrification part B to this question, which is, the Hyde Park itself is a pretty peculiar place. So I had some guests in for a socially distant hello a few days ago, and it was my buddy who brought his son, and his son's grown man now in college, so we're all like laughing and joking about that. And he's like, yeah, gentrification here looks very different from gentrification where I'm at. And he was in, he's living in a different sort of place. He's like, yeah, gentrification here is like Black folks at a Chipotle, like that. Like, that's kind of how he described it, which I thought was perfect to think about, quote, downtown Hyde Park. And harkens back to 2 points. So one is Chris's earlier reminder that Hyde Park looks ridiculous in comparison to the residential segregation that's sort of going down, and Alex's point about the Black and white against the poor as the old cry. And it makes me think a lot about what actual residential home ownership, for example, looks like in Hyde Park, and the fact that you can't buy a house for less than $800,000. And despite that, what's the Jamaican spot? Like the what's it called? Ja Grill is popping. It's popping. Like that's that is a Black and you on the South Side, so that Black folks would this is a strip. This is a place to congregate for Black people. It's a source of vitality, certainly, like youth, culture in a particular kind of way. But the police are also always right there. So I just really want us to think about some of the complications of the visual that this kind of development produces. When you have concerts, Twister's gonna play at what's the spot right there on 53rd Street, Promontory. Twister's gonna play at Promontory. You know what I mean? Like when you got there's a particular kind of vibrant youth culture, Black youth culture, proudly Black. You can buy a Harriet Tubman said nah t-shirt, on the strip. Can we think about the some of the tensions here between that and the reality of gentrification in Hyde Park, and a shifting politic that comes in when diversity becomes sexy. Like that to me is something worth thinking about.
But that's because it is a particular type of Blackness and a particular type of person of color. And it is I'm going to say it's a temporary thing. So the reason you can have Ja Grill and it be this place is because it's a temporary stopping point. You get in and you get out. You better not linger around, right? That's the general, sentiment of Hyde Park and the broader community. And so when we're talking about what role does gentrification play with the police in UChicago? It means that you have to understand the history of policing in the city. And it has largely been the policies of policing in the city have largely centered around the criminalization of people of color. So crime looks a certain way, right? So it becomes embodied in certain individuals. And that's how we stop crime, is by policing those particular individuals in those particular neighborhoods. So it's largely been in Hyde Park, the history of UChicago police and policing has been to keep those people out, right? That's the whole purpose of segregation, right? It's to keep people contained in specific areas. I'll give you a really concrete example of how these all intersect. The Harris School, I'm not trying to call them out. The Harris School has a policy where if you go there, you have to show your ID to get inside of the building. Now, as Alex said, a lot of these buildings are like public places. People from the community can go in these buildings, right? I have an office, because I work at a lab, in the Harris School of Public Policy. The desk person knows me. I've been there. Every single time I have to show my ID, right? But other people don't, right? I get checked when I go into buildings. I get checked. I got to pull out my ID. In the Harris School, I've had it happen to me in various buildings. And it's about protecting the space, right? Keeping certain people out and only accepting certain people in, right? So that's what our relationship is. We're a part of the community, but we're not of the community, right? That's what gentrification is, and its relationship to the outside community and UChicago. It is the policing and allowing certain people in and keeping certain people out. And the UChicago police and all of the policings around the way we conduct ourselves on campus enforce that, right? It's a boundary. It creates a boundary, and we keep certain people out. And to the extent that they come in, you can only be here temporarily, because if you stay too long, it's going to be a problem. You're a problem, right? That's the relationship. But this is a part of a broader structure of how the Chicago Police Department and policies of the city treat folks of color all throughout the city. We just live in a microcosm, right? So that's my response to the question. And if any of you are in the Harris School, I'm sorry. I'm not trying to come at you guys, but this is like a real life application of that. Like when we card people for coming in buildings, we're sending the message that certain people don't belong here, right? Although we make policy for people throughout the city.
This is a powerful point, and maybe something we'll come back to, maybe we won't. It's interesting. I'm thinking about some of the work at the Columbia Center for Justice, where the card, on the one hand, Columbia University, like every other university, practices the same sorts of patterns of exclusion and is set aside for people who can get in, afford to be around, places like this. So very similar dynamics. But I was thinking about what it means to have that ID, what it means. So there's a Center for Justice which works with basically formerly incarcerated, what are they, Alice, the title, there's a title, Alice probably is in the back of her mind too.
Beyond the Bars?
The Beyond the Bars Fellows, there it is. And I remember, thank you so much. And I remember some of the fellows, I remember having a conversation with one or two of the fellows who talked to me about what it meant to have that ID, that Columbia University stamp. And I think though, while that's beautiful, I think that's a very similar seduction of a Ja Grill, of a promontory, of a hip hop night, of a jazz showcase, of a Nah t-shirt at the Silver Room, of a Hyde Park block party, of a look at all the beautiful people in hanging out together. And this is all fun. But anyway, I'm rambling, so I'm going to stop. Let's move to the next question. So this is a question directly from Mr. Williams. But Mr. Williams, would you please, but anyone jump in, would you please elaborate on the differences between university police and CPD in terms of policing practices and responses? Does one behave more aggressively with the community than the other, is the question.
I would say, so the difference is, the very basic difference is that the UChicago Police Department is a private police force. They only get permission to exist and police the city via the Chicago Police Department. They don't have to exist. The Chicago Police Department, I think they are in the city's charter. So they, unless we change the city charter, can't really get rid of police, but we could get rid of the UChicago Police Department. And as far as, I'll try to be really brief, the responses are often intertwined. The UChicago Police Department has more authority to do stuff beyond the Chicago Police Department on campus because it's a private entity. They're not as, to the extent that they do stuff on campus, obviously they have regulations that they have to do with the federal, local, and state laws, but as a private entity, they can have a little bit more leeway. As far as aggressive or non-aggressive, I wouldn't characterize it as that because I think for the people who are being policed, it doesn't really matter who's more aggressive. It doesn't matter if you have your boot on my neck or my head. There's not really that much of a difference. What I would reframe the question as is that they're often interrelated, right? The responses are connected as a part of a policing apparatus, and they often borrow from each other. But they both get their, justifications. They both utilize the Chicago Crime Lab and the strategic support centers that come out of the UChicago Crime Lab. So you have a mix of both UChicago employees, UChicago police, and CPD coming together to run the strategic support centers, which basically have high-tech shot spotter information. They sit in a lab and they watch, view the city. Specifically, there are like 6 of them. And that's kind of how it works. So they're intertwined, not so much separately. The only difference is one is private, one is public, but they work together and can be seen as an overlapping force.
So our next question is, Chicago has a rich history of community and labor organizing, but oftentimes this work is done in relative isolation from other communities or workplaces. How have local campaigns you've been involved with tried, successfully or not, to build power across neighborhood and socioeconomic boundaries in the city? It's an open question.
I think there's a number of exciting coalitions that exist in the city across neighborhoods. So the Chicago Housing Initiative is a group of housing organizers around the city from different community organizations, Southwest, North Side, even Northwest Side. The Grassroots Collaborative is a community labor group. United Working Families is a community labor group. Grassroots Education Movement is a group that working on education, includes the Chicago Teachers Union and community organizations working on education issues. So yeah, I think there's a number of like really rich spaces where you see exactly that.
Yeah, I think that you can be really intentional in how you think about, or how we all think about organizing. The Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, very much overcame certain boundaries, right? In terms of having lawyers, activists, educators, artists, cultural organizers, young BLM activists, and torture survivors and their family members all coming together to fight for reparations legislation, and historically, I think, to fight for justice in the Chicago police torture cases. But I think it is important, you know, the question of being intentional around that is something that is important to be mindful of, because it means that, you know, we live in one of the most segregated cities in the country. And in order to be able to have a real coalition, real cross-class organizing that exists, it means that you have to think about, where do your meetings take place? You have to think about, you know, University of Chicago actually has been a space, you know, that has at different times opened its doors to people on campus. But do you meet on campus when community members have a very difficult time finding where the classroom actually is? I know that when I invite visitors to come to my classes, it's always a challenge, you know, directing people to the classroom. So you have to be very conscientious about things like where you actually meet, and is it a space that is welcoming to folks in the community. And I think that if you think about those kinds of questions, then you can be successful in organizing together, but you have to be mindful of those kinds of things. I also want to just say a word about another boundary that is important to actually cross, and that is inside-outside organizing, right? Parole Illinois, I think, is an example of an organization that is really working with people on the inside to challenge long-term sentencing. I mean, specifically right now, they're working on legislation that would provide a mechanism for release. Most people who live in our state have no idea that Illinois abolished the parole system in 1978. So people have no mechanism for release in our state outside of serving their entire sentences. So Parole Illinois works very closely. Advocates on the outside work very closely with people on the inside. And it's very challenging to do. It's very difficult to do, because communication, when you're incarcerated, you're effectively disappeared from from society. So figuring out how to communicate with people so they can actually play an active role and make decisions alongside advocates on the outside about, you know, how you should compromise on a piece of legislation, when you shouldn't compromise. And that also means that you have to build relationships with folks. So I think, you know, thinking about the relationship building that Alex mentioned previously, but also thinking one step further in terms of not limiting it just to our free world, but actually thinking about how do we involve people who are incarcerated really in any of our campaigns feels really critical and important to me.
This brings me to the last question for the Q&A, which is, and raises important questions about how we think about groups of people to connect with. I mean, that was a beautiful point. Like, there's so many folks who we don't go to, we're not proximate to. But that question is, thinking of these communities, you know, communities in scare quotes, because, you know, this is a sociological panel. So like terms like community and stuff like that, like always contentious, but presuming that it's okay to use this. Why should the local community care about fostering a relationship with us? It's a great question. What should the expected return on investment be from the perspective of the community? What should the action steps be from the University of Chicago to make these investments sustainable over a long period of time? Michael Theodore came for a fight. This is great. I love it.
I would see it much more as, why should we care about fostering a relationship with the local community? Because I think the local community is under siege from us. And so, I mean, the investment on their part is that they actually are affected a lot by our policies, but of the university, but it's more of a question of why should we be invested in our footprint on the community, especially as folks who are part of it, because you pay your tuition dollars, we pay into the UChicago system, and whether you like it or not, you're contributing to the policing of the community around us. You're contributing to policies of housing displacement. You're contributing to the locking up of folks. And so if you're gonna be here in folks' community and you're gonna be complicit in those things, then that has to be our investment. So if you are okay with locking people up, if you're okay with displacing people, which I would imagine if you're at this panel, you're not, then I think that's why you have to be invested in bringing folks in. Because otherwise, like, these people are we are in a privileged position. Those folks out in the community have to deal with UChicago and the city of Chicago, right? Two overlapping forces. So I think it is much more a question of we need to care because we are actively doing stuff, and we are complicit whether we choose to engage or not, right? And so the action steps really quick for us, again, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. We have to be proximate. I mean, this is Alice's point. We have to be proximate to people. We have to know our geography. We have to know the people in the community. And we have to lobby campus. We have to lobby decision makers and actually change policy. We can't just say, go out and do nothing. Like, we have to lobby these people who are making the decisions. We have to lobby the provost. We have to lobby the crime labs who are promulgating policy that the city of Chicago police is implementing, right? Lobby those labs, right? Lobby these offices and these people who are going into the communities and promulgating policy. That includes scholars too, right? So, and invite people from the community into the space. Learn from the community, center their voices. That's what I was.
I guess the way that I'll approach that question is that, what I've seen in my 2 years being part of the campus with the lab, inviting folks, people who are formerly incarcerated, people who have lived experience onto the campus to speak to students, to share their knowledge with us, to do projects with us, with folks, with students, with faculty on campus, that those kinds of initiatives and efforts are welcome by the community members I've worked with, right? And I think that we want to make the university a place and a space that really it can become a hub for that kind of activity, right? I think it doesn't solve the problem. I think that Alex has raised, the bigger questions about the way in which the university has extracted resources and wealth from the South Side of Chicago. Those are bigger questions that we need to have, but I think that we can do both and by creating, and insisting that the university is a space for this and that it values that kind of knowledge and values those kinds of relationships. I think that we can work towards building more power to address those bigger questions. So I don't know if it's why should the local community care. It's more, to me, the way that I see it is that people in the community should have access to all the resources that people within the university community actually have. I mean, it should be an open space for that. And we do, those of us who work within those spaces can think about how do we, push things in that direction while also thinking about the bigger questions of, what is owed, what kind of reparations needs to be done, systemic and policy changes that need to happen, at the University of Chicago, but also citywide and nationwide, what needs to happen.
I would say two things. One, there is a a long historical, deep-seated distrust and hatred, you could say, for the university in the community. I think one of the easiest door knocking, canvassing campaigns that I ever engaged in was the work around the trauma center, because when you knocked on people's doors, do you support the university open up a trauma center? It was both tapping into people's emotional relationship to the gun violence epidemic and folks that have been lost, and this like mistrust and hatred of the university, right? And the feeling that they need to do more. And so it was always the easiest, yes, what can I do to get involved conversation. But the flip side of that is that I've also found there's like an extreme openness to actually engaging with folks in the university. I mean, when I was a young student, talking with elders on Cottage Grove about how my school was trying to kick them out, and they welcomed us with open arms to have barbecues and conversations and build, and that's always been kind of the approach, and I think that kind of hospitality and willingness to engage is there, and it's just one that's worth investing in, especially to Alice's point about these are long-term problems and long-term fights, and along the way you can build beautiful long-term relationships, and that's something that I think is valued by everybody on both sides. In terms of the specific action steps, there's work that I mentioned earlier around the CBA. There's a UChicago group called UChicago against displacement that folks could learn more about and get involved with, that's working to see that the university plays a role in stabilizing housing for low-income and working families, and doesn't displace folks. I also mentioned Care Not Cops, which is a pretty active organization as well, working on abolishing the University of Chicago police. So I would mention lift up those two groups.
Great, that's a perfect segue into those sorts of things. Thank you for those suggestions. Chris or Alice, if you have suggestions that folks can get involved in. And then there's one more request for any interesting documentaries or films about Chicago, about the question is if you know of any great movies, documentaries, TV series, et cetera, on Chicago's social economic reality, or at least to give it a fair presentation. So on the one hand, actions that people get involved in, and on the other hand, any beautiful films that come to mind, which, that's super on the spot. We got 1 minute, but if nothing comes to mind, maybe we'll try to curate some sort of answer for this person, the anonymous attendee later. So, but anyway, any thoughts?
You said on like documentaries to watch?
Documentaries to watch, and of course, actions to get involved in.
Oh, I don't know of any particular documentaries currently. I know like older documentaries that folks can watch, but I think steps to get involved. If you're on campus, you should be lobbying, or first of all, know the history. You should get involved, like Alex said, with organizations like Care Not Cops, the folks who are doing stuff like that. I think you should look up the university's footprint, obviously. You want to figure out, even in your own scholarship, how can you subvert these structures? Who can you lobby? Who are the people you need to talk to? How can you set up coalitions with folks? And a personal plug for me, you should look into how can we dismantle centers on campus or particular labs on campus that participate in these policies that we've talked about, like the crime lab.
Great.
So in terms of a book, one book that people may be interested in is The War on Neighborhoods, Policing, Prison, and Punishment in a Divided City. That's by Ryan Lugalia Holland and his co-author, Daniel Cooper. So that's one book. And just very specific to the John Birch torture cases, there is a great documentary called The End of the Nightstick that really illustrates the beginnings of the campaigns and struggles around seeking justice for survivors of police torture, and also shows the city's complicity and the ways in which this struggle, this has been a 40-year struggle, so you can go back and actually see what it looked like when people first began organizing around these cases. And Care Not Cops, people have already spoken to. I will also say that sometimes we don't always know all of the answers to how to address these problems. And actually Ruben and I and some other faculty from SSA are actually going to be discussing and thinking together. We've been thinking together about, you know, how we can actually, what role universities can play in ending mass incarceration. And, you know, we all have some thoughts. I think the lab has been trying to really nurture a partnership with the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education Project so that the University of Chicago can be involved in supporting, you know, prison education programs inside our prisons. But I think that beyond that, there are many things that we can be thinking about. There was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education that basically asserted that you know, universities are hotbeds of scholarship on mass incarceration, but are they doing enough to end it? And so sometimes it means asking the question, posing the question, and asking it of ourselves, and being in conversation with each other so that we can begin to, you know, lay out either some concrete steps and also just think more broadly about this kind of question with one another. So I'll just put that out there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So let me just say thank you to the panelists, to Alice, Alex, and Chris for what I think was a wonderful conversation. And thank you to all the folks who raised questions. Peter, anonymous attendee, Dana, Michael, and Michael. And thank you to our hosts, Noah, Sarah, Raina, and Andrew, who are folks working the boards. We appreciate your time and look forward to continued conversations.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.
Thanks,
Peace.
everyone.